Sorry.
So we'll read the 8th chapter of Daniel tonight, please, because we finished up last time into chapter 7. We certainly didn't do justice to the first 7 chapters, but we'll press on and go into chapter 8. I'll read the whole chapter if you don't mind. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there, standing beside the river, was a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. As I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore, the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of the one there came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of the heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifice, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one that was speaking, "How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed." Then it happened, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end." Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and stood me upright, and he said, "Look, I'm making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. For at the appointed time the end shall be. The ram which you saw, having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the horns that came up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. And in the latter time of their kingdom, where the transgressions have reached their fullness, a king shall arise having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. And the vision of the evenings and the mornings, which was told, is true. Therefore, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward I arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. But when we began this little series on Daniel, we set a sort of framework, a structure for studying the book. And we said at that time that the usual way, or usual way, is to divide the book into two parts, the narratives and the prophecies. Some people speak about the first and the second part of Daniel, and that's not very accurate because there's at least an overlap. But we approached it slightly differently, you remember, and it was on the basis of the two languages that are found to be the writing of the book. Daniel is written in Aramaic and in Hebrew, and we're introduced in the first chapter to the Hebrew part of it, the first chapter in Hebrew. Chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, and chapters 8 through 12 are written again in Hebrew. That gives us a tripartite division of the book, and it's helpful, I think, at least for one reason, and there's another, which I wouldn't say too loudly, but at least for one reason, and it's this, that to me, it underlines the principal lessons of the book. And within that, you find that the narratives and the prophecies are totally put together. They're linked together. I know it's taking a scripture out of context, but I might say in that regard that what God has joined together, we should not be about separating. There is one book, Daniel, and the prophecies and the narratives that are given in that book, I think, are to be seen in their cohesion. And they teach us a very valuable lesson or lessons. And I think they are these. One is how we are to behave. And this is the principal lesson, I think, how we are to behave as disciples of Christ, how we are to behave in a chaotic world that surrounds us, that has rejected God. And our behavior, our conduct in this world is guided by what God has made known to us. And that's the other great facet of the book of Daniel. God has made known to Daniel, and through Daniel to us, things that we would have never clue about otherwise. He extends it when you get to John's Revelation, of course, but these are a marvelous insight into things that otherwise we would have no knowledge of whatsoever. Why has God told us this? God doesn't tell us everything, of course. But why has God told us what he has told us? It must be so that we are as prepared as possible to live the life of discipleship as we ought to live it. So we're instructed for that purpose, that we should serve God and serve him acceptably. So these are the lessons of the book of Daniel. To know what God has taught us, to have an understanding of the things that he's taught us, so that we might conduct our lives. What we know affects our actions, doesn't it? That's a fact of life, everybody. When you come into Christian things, it's often been almost the meaning, definition of Christian ethics, that by our thinking we conduct ourselves in a certain way. So it's of utmost importance that our thinking is right, so that our actions might be right. One follows the other. So that's the thing. What we need to know, in other words, what God has told us, and he knows what we need to know, what we don't need to know. But what we do need to know, I suggest to you, out of the book of Daniel at least, is this, amongst other things, that however powerful and however threatening the forces that are framed against us appear to be, there is a greater power that is for us. Now, I know you find that in different parts of the Bible, but it's here written large in Daniel. You referred to it, Johnny, in the opening prayer, that things were looking pretty dire, and yet there was a more powerful thing at force at work, and that was God himself, of course. And that's always the way. We need to be reminded of that, because it's easy to get that knocked out of our thinking, I think. It gives us what the world calls these days a world of view. That is, how do I assess what's going on around me in this chaotic, confusing and confused world? It is confused itself. So it can hardly, it would only be expected that it then is confusing of the people it seeks to teach. And it's a world that's full of chaos because it's lost in sin, of course. The fundamental lessons then arising from the book of Daniel, I suggest you are the three. The way of the world, sorry, the first is the way of the world is seen as being opposed to God. So it's the way of the world, but mark its destiny, because Daniel makes that clear. Secondly, there's the way of God with his covenanted people, that's Israel. That's seen clearly in this book, which is even yet to be worked out. And mark their destiny, very different to the world's destiny, it's assured. And thirdly, the third great lesson, and one that's most pertinent, I think, to you and me, is how the faithful conduct their lives in view of what God tells them. So they're the three lessons of the book. Just as a reminder, the three parts of Daniel are chapter 1, the first part that's written in Hebrew, which is the personal background of Daniel. Part 2 is written in Aramaic, and it's the prophetic course of Gentile dominion, showing, and that's just coming out of that tonight. And then chapter 3, the prophetic course of Israel's destiny. We're really into that tonight. It's verses chapter 8 through 12. It's this last section, but chapters 8 to 12 that occupies through November. And last time we were together, we were in chapter 7, and you may remember the four beasts, if you were there, or you'll know what chapter 7 is about anyway, the four beasts that Daniel saw arising out of the Great Sea, that would be the Mediterranean. The first was representative of Babylon. The second, that was the lion with the eagle's wings. The second was representative of the Medo-Persian Empire. Always seen together, the Medes and the Persians, by the way, in scripture. Secular history may recall it slightly differently, but God sees it as together. We're going to see that again tonight. But in chapter 7, last time, it was the second of the beasts, which was the bear that was raised up on one side with the ribs in its mouth and so on. And the third beast, you remember, was the leopard that had all the four heads and so on. These were the beasts that was the representative of the Greek Empire. And they're the three beasts that Daniel saw rising out of the sea. And then he saw a fourth. And this is where that vision differs to Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where he saw the image of the gold head, the silver bust, the bronze belly, the iron legs, and then the feet of iron and clay. Seems to be a link between the two. But in Daniel's vision of the beasts, the fourth beast is not likened to a lion, a bear, or a leopard. It's something that cannot be compared. It's inimitably ferocious. If you think the others were bad enough, this thing is absolutely terrifying. And there'd be nothing like it. And Daniel tells us that this is a kingdom that will yet come. Seems to have links with the Roman Empire, but it's yet future to the day in which we live. And it's the most terrifying prospect. It's going to come with awful power and influence, and murderous, of course. And of course, we've seen that all through human history, but this is going to be worse than human history has ever recorded. So out of that kingdom, he then says there's going to be one who arises, who through compliance and through confederacy and through corruption and through compromise is going to forge together a world force to annihilate Israel. We'll speak about him, God willing, another night, because we're going to have to come to him, the Antichrist, of course. But this is the beginning of that picture in chapter 8, where we're beginning to see things arranged against God's people, Israel, which is against God himself, of course. I wondered at this point whether it might be wise to mention a question that arises in the minds of some people. Why should we be so taken up with the destiny of Israel? Why is that important to us today? Is it not just a matter of history or political fascination at the moment? And why is it that Christians are almost obsessed with Israeli history, even to the current day? Well, the answer to that is, of course, is that Israel have a covenant with God. God made it with Abraham. And that covenant has yet to have an outworking. So we are fascinated by this because, and here's the rub, if the promises that God made to Israel, and that nation has been at the point of annihilation several times, if that had ever happened, and if ever God's promises could be shown to be flawed, to be unreliable, then everything that God has said may be regarded as unreliable. So it's just of the greatest importance to you and me what happens to Israel. Satan has this intent purpose to defame God. And if he can get it into the minds of people that God can't be trusted, who would come to him for salvation? We have come, and we trust that salvation is absolutely secure. And we examine and examine and examine and find that all God's promises and purposes are absolutely sure and certain. It's not one of them that's ever been stood on its head. They've been taken to the wire. But God doesn't mind being taken to the wire, if you excuse me putting it that way, because still doesn't mean that his purposes are lost causes. So that's why we're interested. Several years ago, I may have told you this before, I was visiting Norman Miller, the Glasgow Assembly. Norman's long at home with the Lord, he's a famous artist. And Norman showed me a book that he had of photographs of the Earth taken from space. I can't remember the span of photographs it was in. The first photograph taken of the Earth was in 1946, taken from a rocket, would you believe? There were other photographs taken from satellites, but I think most of these photographs were taken from the Apollo spacecraft, which began in the 1960s, and they were the ones that took those stunning pictures. They were called the blue marble. Was it called the blue marble or something like that? And it just looked so beautiful, the Earth, with the partial cloud cover and so on. And Norman flicked over the pages for a look at this. And he showed me one of them, and you could make out just roughly with partial cloud cover the continent of Africa. You can make out the continent of Asia. And then there was a clear line, which was the Mediterranean coastline of Israel. And the land of Israel was quite clearly delineated. And Norman, very, very excited, said, you know, Phil, he said, God parted the clouds to allow them to take that picture. And I'm sure he's right. Because the purposes of God for this earth have been centered in what we call the Middle East. It was in that region, undoubtedly, that Eden was located. It was from Ur of the Chaldees that God spoke to Abraham, brought him around the Fertile Crescent into the land of Canaan. And it was in that land that he brought his people into, and Egypt back into the land. It was the land he's given to them, and that would yet be seen to have his extended borders and so on. That's where God's purposes have been centered, and it does, you know, above everything else that I've just said. I don't know how you reckon it, but I'm going to say to you, roughly 160 miles by 60 miles wide, by 160 miles north to south, was the region in which the Son of God himself walked on earth. Tiny little bit of this planet. And if planet's a tiny planet in the whole scheme of things, he came and walked in that little area because the purposes of God for all creation were enacted in that location. Geography is important. It's in that precise spot that we call the Middle East at the center of God's dealing with the earth. That's the setting for Daniel chapter 8, what we've just been reading. I hope you see that in the geography of that. Now, the identity of the ram and the goat in Daniel chapter 8, rather thankfully, I say this, is not open to conjecture, because we're told you get a relief, don't you, when there's and the ram is, and the goat is. He said, well, that's going to save us a lot of making up stuff. So quite clearly, the ram is the Medo-Persian Empire, and the two horns representing, I suppose, the two parts of that. The Persians were stronger than the Medes, so maybe the larger of the two very high horns, but one was higher than the other. So there's the Persians and the Medes. And here's a kingdom that pretty well did what it liked. After all, they had trounced the Babylonians. That's no mean thing. I know Belshazzar was, a bit of a waster by the time they got to that point, but nevertheless, hugely powerful empire. And the Medes and Persians came in and took them just like that. And not just that, but if you read history, you'll find that the Medes and Persians did that across that Far East and Middle East, I should say, area, and their little empire extended and extended. So that's the ram doing this thing, and it says here nobody could stop the ram. And then until a goat came that didn't touch the ground, and we're told that's Greece. And one horn between its eyes. It's got to be a picture of Alexander the Great, hasn't it? So Alexander the Great, they say, do you know, if you read Encyclopedia Britannica or Wikipedia or whatever, you read a sort of potted history of Alexander the Great, it's breathtaking. I don't know whether you've ever done it, but it's actually breathtaking. The speed in which he conquered and set up what became as the Greek Empire was astounding. That's the goat that's seen here, not touching the earth or the ground. He's going at such speed. He had a famous horse, of course, that's supposed to have gone at such great speed. But then that horn, that great horn, which, by the way, completely mashed the ram. This ram that was doing all it could and wanted when it wanted and all the rest of it, suddenly it was gone, finished, because the goat's come. I'm smiling at this inwardly, but this is how the kingdoms of the earth fare. They think they're everything until they're nothing. And it's written through and through history. Why do men not learn that lesson? It would take away every thought of arrogance and pride out of the heart, but it doesn't, unfortunately. Anyway, Alexander comes, takes away the Medes and the Persians, and the Greek Empire is set until the horn is broken. Alexander died at the age of 33. May have been drinking too much. It may have been dysentery. It may have been, but he didn't die in battle. He died a sick man. And his great kingdom that he brought about with such force and speed was divided up among four of his generals: Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucid, and Ptolemy. Four generals of the Greek army, and each took a slice. And it wasn't long before they started warring with each other. It says they didn't have the power, which is here. This is history. Daniel chapter 8 is history past. It's been played out. Don't push it into prophecy future. We'll come to that in succeeding chapters. But this is the Greek Empire overtaking the Medes and Persians, and itself being not up to what Alexander had been. And then there's this horn, is the four horns, the four generals. And then out of the four horns, not one of them, but from them, another little horn arises. And that, all historians are quite certain, is a man called Antiochus. There were lots of Antiochuses, but this particular infamous man is Antiochus IV. He dubbed himself Antiochus Epiphanes, which means behold God, or God is here, or something like that, a manifestation of God. That's the arrogance of this man, by the way. He put a coin with Antiochus Epiphanes on it. I am God. Don't think that just belongs to footballers uttering foolish notions. This was a world ruler, or a wannabe world ruler. Anyway, this man, Antiochus IV, made war against the Ptolemy, the region of Ptolemy. Ptolemy himself had died. This was about 100 years later. And he began to move south, south and east, began to move south into the region of Ptolemy's kingdom. So he took Palestine. That's the glorious land referred to. And then he moved into North Africa and took Egypt. And he would have carried on in that thing if Rome, which was just on the ascendancy at this time, beginning to rattle its saber, Rome sent an envoy to stop him. It's a great story. I won't stop for now. I'll tell you another time because of time. But a man called Popilius met Antiochus in northern Africa and drew a line around him. I'm telling you now, drew a line around him with the sand. He said, Rome wants you to go home to stop this rampage. Go home. And Antiochus, this arrogant upstart, said, oh, I'll think about it. So, what's his name? Popilius took his staff and quickly he drew a line all the way around where Antiochus was standing. He said, you take as long as you like to make up your mind, he said. But as soon as you step out of that circle, know that Rome knows what your mind will be. So I think Antiochus worked out that he really didn't have a lot of strength to fight Rome, and he went home. Not quite with his tail between his legs, because going home from Africa, so from northern Africa, he's going through the glorious land. You know, he takes out his vengeance on the occupants of the glorious land. He kills the high priest, the man Polonius, and he forbids the sacrifice of Jehovah, of God. And he may have done that on his way through, by the way. Let me tell you about this 2,300 days here, because there's been different views about that. 2,300 days equates to 6 years and 111 days. So that's 6 years and 3 or 4 months. Or it may be that these are evenings and mornings, which you remember there was a sacrifice taken to the altar of Israel, one in the morning, one in the evening, in which case you have to halve it and you get 1,150 days, which equates to 3 years and about a month and a half or something. Now, it's difficult to tie that in to history, but it doesn't really matter. What I'm saying to you is at some point, Antiochus prohibited the worship of God in the land of Israel. And then he himself was ousted out of Philistine by Judas Maccabeus. Remember him? The one that the Jews still celebrate, that great victory now. And Maccabeus won over Antiochus and sent him away. And he reconsecrated the temple. And that seems to be the end that's referred to here, when the temple was put back in its place again. This was the temple, by the way. Solomon had built the original, and that was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. The remnant had rebuilt that temple under the guidance of Zerubbabel, and that was the temple. And Antiochus Epiphanes, I don't even like to use that name, it's so arrogant. Antiochus IV had entered and forbidden the worship of God in the house of God. And on his way back from Egypt, he set up a temple on top of an altar, on top of the altar of burnt offering. Think about it. The altar of burnt offering and all that it means to you and me. And Antiochus IV put an altar on top of the altar of burnt offering. He sacrificed a pig on it. Imagine what that meant to Jewish minds. And it was to Zeus. And he dedicated the temple in Jerusalem to the Olympian god Zeus. That was the infamy of Antiochus, and he's still held in absolute hatred by the Jewish people today for what he did. This is the intervening period, by the way, between our testaments. So that's the history that we have recorded here in Daniel chapter 8. But what I wanted to mention to you is, remember that when Daniel's been told this hasn't happened. This lies in the future for Daniel. He's living at the time of the lion with the wing, at this time with the lion with the wings of an eagle. Still the Babylonian Empire when he has this vision. maybe the last throes of it, and he's about to be taken by the bear with the ribs in his mouth, or with the other thing, what was the leopard? Yes, thank you. But he said those things haven't happened yet. So Daniel's looking forward to the things, the spring things that we had happened. I'll just tell you this: the matter of world kingdoms and how we should view them. Not to be disrespectful, of course, or not regarding of world responsibilities, rulers, and so on, but just to reckon in the things that God has told us in Daniel, apart from anywhere else in this book, we learn that world kingdoms are set in their place, and we must never forget that place. And it forbids men to step over the traces of what God has given them to do, because at the end of the day, they are but men. I read a thing recently, and it really, oh, thanks, sir. Yeah, sorry, is that around there?
Yes, fine.
The Nuremberg trials, 1946 was it? And at the end of those trials, 14 men were executed. I think one of them had already taken, the 15 had already taken his own life. But 14 men were executed, and they would not afford those men, Nazi war criminals, anything of any honor in their burial. So they were sent to a crematorium in Munich, and a container full of the ashes of 14 men was put into a vehicle that night and driven for about an hour into the Bavarian countryside. And the vehicle stopped, and the container was poured into a muddy ditch. You know, you wind the clock back 4 or 5 years from now, those men thought they could do what they liked with anybody. And like Antiochus, they thought they could do what they liked with God's people, the Israeli nation. And that night, they were washed away in a drizzle. Where's the power? It's the power of God. And it puts all the power of men into a very small container. And it makes you think. And it makes you pray for world rulers, for the huge responsibility that they bear, and the limitations of their influence. The other thing I want to say about limitations, sorry if these sorts are a bit scattered, is going back to the days. Whether they're 6 years or 3 years, whatever. That's not the point, because we may not know exactly what they refer to, it doesn't matter. What it tells me is that during those horrendous days, when that awful atrocity was happening in Jerusalem, God had said, there's a limit to it. It's not going to go on forever. It's limited. It's actually precisely, it's a number of days, and God knew what he meant by the days. And it's another thing that we have to take into our thinking, that it's not forever. I've used this illustration before, and I confess to you, I'm not happy with it because it sounds sort of trivial, and I do not mean to be trivial about anything with this, obviously. But when I was a boy, I went to the dentist, like everybody does, and in Crowborough. And it was a bad experience because we had a dentist. Basically, he'd missed his vocation. He should have been a butcher. He just got it all wrong. And somehow he got into dentistry, and it was cruel. I mean, he was just a purveyor of pain. The man was just dreadful. I remember his name, Mr. Bly. I remember it all my days. But I remember sitting in his chair sometimes like this, inflicting pain on me, and thinking to myself, this can't last forever. This is not going to last forever. This is not going to last forever. I'll soon get out of here and I'll be playing football on the street with my friends or whatever it was I was going to do. And that's what keeps you going. Well, you know what I'm saying, on a much more important scale. God says, however painful the experience we're going through, there's a limit on it. The God of everlasting puts limits on the responsibilities he gives to men. So we need to keep that in mind. Let's see where I've got up to here, sorry. This thing about Daniel being told what's going to happen ahead of him. Despite what I've just said about the limitations, Daniel is not being told here, just hang on in there, Daniel, because it's all going to get rosy pretty soon. It's not that, is it? It's actually God saying to Daniel, things are going to get pretty bad. It's the same message you get to Habakkuk. Remember, Habakkuk thought, when's this going to end? God says, oh, it's going to get worse. And sometimes God says that to us, it's going to get worse before it's going to get better. As far as the world's concerned, you know that. So that reminds me of Mark 13 and the Lord's words when he says, you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. Now, think back to Daniel 8, and in your mind, if you can hold the two things together, think about the world we live in right now. It's not just Ukraine, but it's everywhere. You'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. Nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Then he says, this is the beginning of sorrows. At the end, he says, this is the beginning of sorrows. And then you read in Revelation the other things that God's told us about what's going to happen. And horrendous things. God does not pull the punches. He tells us as it is. And he does it so that we might be prepared for what's happening. Evil days of trouble, and there's days to come when things are going to get bad. But we shouldn't be dismayed at that, because Peter says, 2 Peter 3, he says, God is not slack concerning his promises, as some count slackness, but is long suffering to you. He does not will that anyone should perish, but that all should come to repentance. That's God's timetable, and we shouldn't question it. Sometimes we get impatient and we want things to happen, but it's a different thing. So remember that in all the trials and tribulations, and Daniel saw them too, and they were a picture really of what has been all through all the ages, and we know it to some extent. God is doing his work still, and though things are bad, great things are happening. Let me tell you very quickly, I was sharing with Buxton on Sunday morning, Sunday after midday, noon ministry. In Philippians chapter 4:22, Paul's signing off his letter to the Philippians, and he says, my brethren who are with me, they send their greetings. All the saints greet you. And then he says, and especially those who are of Caesar's household. Who are they? Paul's writing from Rome. Who are these people who are greeting the Church of God in Philippi, back there in Asia Minor, from Rome? Well, people of Caesar's household. Were they stewards? Were they cooks? Were they stable lads? Or were they soldiers? Or what were they? Accountants? I don't know what they were. But there were people in all the great array of people that served Caesar. And what I love about this is that Paul says these are saved people. These are your brothers and sisters, and they're sending you greetings, Philippians. And here's this Caesar, Nero, who thought he was the bee's knees. And he thought everything, happened because Nero allowed it or didn't allow it. And here's another Antiochus, and all of them up together. And Nero's doing these things, strutting his little hour upon the stage. And Paul is really saying, right under Nero's nose, under the nose of Caesar, there's a kingdom that he knows nothing about. Nothing. And it's God's. And it's the one that's going to finish and everything else. And it's eternal. Its dominion is forever. Isn't it good? That's the world we live in. With all the chaos and confusion and all the stuff we see around us. That God's kingdom is going on silently, silently. The town of Bethlehem, but still we see the light. Above thy quiet and dreamless sleeps, the dreamless something go by. Yet in thy dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. Unknown, this quiet thing, God works quietly. interpretation to Daniel about what it all means. I read that and I kind of think, well, I hope it helped Daniel, because I'm not quite sure how it helps us too much, because we have trouble with Gabriel's interpretation, don't we? But anyway, it's pretty well what we said about Antiochus. I think that's how we interpret it. We understand it that way. This thing about things going on, we asked the question again, why is this little sliver of history made such a deal of here in Daniel? And why are we sitting here tonight discussing it? Why is it important? Why has it been put into God's word? Well, I think it's because even though there's little two-bit generals who had an overdose of arrogance and do their thing and think that they can do what they like, there's something else happening. And it's back to Norman's book of photographs, and God is doing what God does in this little corner of the world, as well as every part of the universe. It was in that little corner of the world that there was a room in which 12 men were gathered together. And one of them was speaking with divine authority, because he was God himself in human flesh. And he's speaking to the other 11. And he tells them this is John 16:1. He said, I've spoken these things unto you so that you might not stumble. What things, Lord, did you tell them? He said, I told them that they would be thrown out of the synagogues and they would be put to death. People putting them to death, thinking they were doing something for God by doing it. That's what he told them that so that they would not, so that they would not stumble. So they knew what was going to be ahead. Again, please forgive me for giving you examples that are poor examples, but I remember years ago, Celia, you were there, in Moonlight, Calemia, walking back from the meeting in Moonlight, and there's a few of us, Pauline and Renfrew was there, Steve, I think it was Steve and me, that sort of got ahead a little bit. The others, Road was there too. And we hid behind some trees and jumped out on the others, because it was a dark night, and it's the sort of thing you do if you're very childish. And we were childish that night, and that's what you do, isn't it? But you know, when your children do that to you, or your grandchildren, and you know that they've hidden, and you pretend that you don't know they're hiding, so they jump out, you pretend to be frightened. What's the difference? The difference is if you know something's going to happen, you're not shocked by it. Well, that's what the Lord's saying in John 16. These things I've told you. And I think the Lord will say to us about Daniel 8 and every part of Daniel, every part of his word. These things I've told you so that you do not stumble. It doesn't seem, does it, that God is taking care of some of the details of the world. And you wonder where God is. People say, well, it's God in COVID, and people in Ukraine are asking the same thing. But it is a fact that God is never out of control or insensitive to what's happening in the world. I've often quoted James Russell Lowell's great poem, Careless Seems the Great Avenger. History's pages but record one death's grapple in the darkness. Truth twixt the old ways and the word. Truth forever on the scaffold. Wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch of his hand. It's true, isn't it? Even when things seem so wrong, God is still there, standing sometimes in the shadows, but he's keeping watch of his own. It's never been any other way. And Daniel came to know that, of course, and I'll finish with this. The last verse that we read there, it says, when he got over his shock, he says, then I went about the king's business. He said, oh, Daniel, thanks for that. Because that's exactly what you and I need to be doing. Just get about the king's business, whatever's happening at the